There are chapters of human history that were never meant to be remembered. Not because they were forgotten, but because something, somewhere, ensured they would be buried. Erased from official records. Stripped from sacred texts. Reduced to mythology, to folklore, to the kind of story men tell to keep children from wandering too far into the dark. But the dark remembers. And what it holds is far older, far larger, and far more terrifying than any modern mind has been prepared to confront. Before the flood. Before the great silence that swallowed an entire epoch of existence. Before the waters rose and erased a world that bore almost no resemblance to the one we now inhabit, there was an age. An age that even the most ancient of surviving records describe only in fragments, in whispers, in language deliberately obscured. An age when the boundary between the divine and the terrestrial was not merely thin. It was shattered. And what walked through that rupture left footprints so deep in the earth that we are, even now, still falling into them. This is not a story about giants in the way children imagine them. This is not mythology dressed in comfortable distance. What the ancient records describe, from the Book of Enoch to the Sumerian king lists, from the fragments preserved at Qumran to the oral traditions of cultures separated by oceans and millennia, is something far more specific, far more disturbing, and far more consistent than coincidence should allow. Across every corner of the ancient world, in civilizations that could have communicated with one another, the same account surfaces. Beings of enormous stature and terrible power. Offspring of a union that violated the architecture of creation itself. Entities that did not merely coexist with early humanity. They ruled it. They were called the Nephilim. And if you had been alive in their age, you would not have survived a single day. To understand the magnitude of what Nephilim represented, one must first understand the world they inhabited, and the world they helped destroy. The antediluvian era, the time before the Great Flood, was not simply an earlier chapter of human civilization. According to the oldest preserved records, it was a fundamentally different kind of world. The atmosphere was denser. The lifespans of living creatures stretched across centuries. The land masses themselves may have been configured in ways that bear little resemblance to any modern geography. And into this world, already ancient, already complex, already populated by human civilizations whose sophistication we are only beginning to acknowledge, something descended. The Book of Enoch, one of the most complete surviving accounts of this era, describes them with unsettling precision. The Watchers, a class of divine beings tasked with observing humanity, made a decision that would fracture the order of existence. 200 of them, led by a figure named Azazel and another named Semjaza, descended upon a mountain and took human women as companions. The offspring of these unions were not human. They were not divine in any conventional sense. They were something that had no proper place in the architecture of creation, and they became, according to text, a catastrophe without precedent. The Nephilim grew to heights that modern biology cannot comfortably accommodate. Ancient measurements placed them between 15 and 30 feet in stature, though certain passages suggest even greater extremes. But their size, as terrifying as it was, represented only the most visible dimension of what made them dangerous. They possessed strength that could reduce stone to powder. They required sustenance on a scale that existing agriculture could not support. And when the food ran out, when the harvest failed to satisfy the appetite of beings whose caloric demands exceeded anything the natural world had been designed to provide, they turned to the only remaining source available to them. They turned to man. Consider, for a moment, what it would mean to exist in a world where the apex predator was not a lion, not a bear, not any creature that evolution had shaped through millions of years of natural selection. Imagine instead a being that thinks with something resembling human intelligence, that plans, that strategizes, that remembers, but that stands 3 times your height, possesses strength measured not in human units but in the force required to demolish architecture, and that regards you not as a peer, not even as a lesser being deserving of consideration, but as sustenance. As an object. As a resource to be consumed when more palatable options were exhausted. This is what the ancient texts describe. Not metaphorically. Not allegorically. With the flat, matter-of-fact language of people recording events they witnessed or events transmitted to them through unbroken chains of oral tradition by people who witnessed them. The Nephilim consumed human beings. And they did so openly, systematically, without fear, because there was nothing in that world capable of stopping them. But physical destruction was not the only horror the age of the Nephilim produced. The Watchers, in addition to their violation of divine law through procreation, brought with them knowledge that humanity had not been given and was not prepared to receive. Azazel, according to the text of Enoch, taught men the art of warfare, the forging of blades, the crafting of shields, the manufacture of instruments designed specifically for the killing of human beings. He taught women the arts of cosmetic enchantment, which the text frames not as vanity but as a form of manipulation, a corruption of perception and desire. Other Watchers taught the reading of omens, the practice of enchantments, the observation of celestial movements for purposes that went far beyond navigation or agriculture. They taught, in essence, how to bend the natural order, how to reach into the mechanics of existence and pull levers that were never meant for human hands. The result was not enlightenment. It was a civilization in freefall. Violence perforated on a scale the texts describe as covering the earth. The knowledge that had been gifted without the accompanying wisdom to use it responsibly became, in the hands of a species that had not earned it, a mechanism of self-destruction. And presiding over all of it, watching with whatever passes for satisfaction in beings of their nature, were the Nephilim, growing larger, growing more numerous, consuming more, destroying more, their very existence an ongoing transgression against the order that had been established at the foundation of the world. Now place yourself inside this world. Not as an observer. Not as a modern human being equipped with the psychological distance that comes from reading ancient texts in comfortable rooms. Place yourself there, in that era, with the body and the resources and the knowledge available to an ordinary person in the pre-diluvian world. Ask yourself, with genuine honesty, how long you would last. You wake before dawn in a settlement that has been built, like all settlements of its age, with as much distance as possible from the places the Nephilim are known to frequent. But distance in an age before fortification, before modern weaponry, before any technology capable of neutralizing a threat of this magnitude, is a measure of hope rather than safety. The Nephilim travel. They are not confined to territories. They move through the landscape with the ease of beings for whom geography is not an obstacle, and they are driven by a hunger that does not recognize borders. The sounds of the night have already told you something is wrong. Not the howling of wolves or the movement of ordinary predators, sounds that antediluvian people, who lived far closer to the natural world than modern humans, would have learned to interpret with precision. Something different. The displacement of air in volumes that suggest mass far beyond any natural creature. Footfalls that send vibrations through the earth before they can be heard. And then, in those moments before everything changes, a shadow that falls across the pre-dawn light in a shape that no tree, no hill, no natural formation could produce. There is nowhere to run that would be fast enough. There is nothing you could build, in the time available, that would be strong enough. There is no weapon in your possession, no blade, no spear, no instrument of any kind, that was designed with a target of this scale in mind. The gap between your physical capacity and what stands before you is not the gap between a soldier and an opponent. It is the gap between a human being and a force of nature. The gap between someone who exists within the food chain and something that regards the food chain itself as a resource. This is the reality the ancient texts are describing. And it is a reality that lasted not for a generation, not for a century, but for what the Sumerian king lists and other antediluvian chronologies suggest was an era of staggering duration. A period during which humanity existed not as the dominant species on its own planet, but as a managed, terrorized, and steadily diminishing population existing in the shadow of beings it had no means to comprehend, let alone oppose. The theological dimensions of the Nephilim age deepen the horror rather than alleviating it. Because the question that emerges from any serious engagement with the ancient accounts is not merely what the Nephilim were, but what they represented. In the framework of the Book of Enoch and the traditions that preserved and extended its core narrative, the descent of the Watchers and the birth of the Nephilim was not an accident. It was not a natural event. It was a deliberate violation, a tear in the fabric of the order that had been established at creation. And the beings that resulted from that violation were not simply dangerous in the physical sense. They were a theological problem of the highest order, entities whose very existence was an argument against the stability and governance of the created world. This is why, the text suggests, the response to the Nephilim age was not a localized military campaign, not a political intervention, not any of the mechanisms that human societies develop to address internal threats. The response was total. Absolute. A reset of such comprehensive violence is remembered, across virtually every major culture on Earth, as the defining catastrophe of pre-modern human memory. The flood was not a natural disaster that mythology retrospectively assigned divine agency. It was, in the framework of the traditions that describe it, the only possible answer to a problem that had exceeded any earthly solution. And yet, and here is where the ancient accounts become genuinely disturbing in their implications, the flood did not end everything. The texts are careful on this point in ways that are easy to miss if one is reading for simple narrative rather than for the specific claims being made. The Nephilim were destroyed. The Watchers were imprisoned, bound, according to Enoch, in the valleys of the earth, awaiting a final judgment that had not yet come. But the corruption they introduced, the knowledge they disseminated without permission, the patterns they established in the consciousness of surviving humanity, these did not drown. They persisted. They emerged on the other side of the catastrophe, carried in memory and in the deeper architecture of human desire, and they shaped the civilizations that rose from the receding waters. We live in a world that is, in the most literal sense, built on erasure. The ground beneath every ancient city contains strata of civilization that predate the civilization we study and claim to understand. The texts that survived the centuries survived because someone chose to preserve them, and the texts that did not survive were lost, in most cases, not through accident but through decision. The age of the Nephilim is not a footnote in the story of humanity. According to the oldest traditions of cultures that had no reason to coordinate their accounts, it was the defining catastrophe of the pre-modern world. The event that required a reset. The wound that every subsequent civilization was, consciously or not, attempting to understand and address. And it ended not because humanity overcame it. Not because some act of human courage or ingenuity or collective will brought the Nephilim age to a close. It ended because the scale of the destruction had become so total, the corruption so comprehensive, that the only possible response was the obliteration of almost everything and the attempt to begin again. You would not survive 12 hours in that world. Not because you are weak in any personal sense, but because the world that existed before the flood was not calibrated for human survival in the way the post-diluvian world eventually became. It was a world in which the hierarchy of creation had been violently disrupted, in which beings of immense power and no moral restraint moved through the earth as its effective owners, in which the knowledge that had been given without wisdom had accelerated civilizational collapse to a pace that left no room for the ordinary mechanisms of human adaptation and survival. The flood, in this reading, was not punishment. It was mercy. It was the only act of protection available at the scale the problem demanded. But the question that the oldest texts leave deliberately unanswered, the question that haunts the margins of Enoch, that surfaces in the darkest passages of the prophetic literature, that threads through the apocalyptic writing of half a dozen ancient traditions, is whether the conditions that produced the Nephilim age are truly historical. Whether they belong, permanently and safely, to a buried past. Or whether the Watchers, bound but not destroyed, waiting in their valleys beneath the earth, represent a pressure that has not been resolved. A wound in the architecture of creation that was sealed but not healed. The texts do not offer reassurance on this point. What they offer is something far more unsettling. They offer the suggestion that this has happened before, and that whether it happens again is not a question already answered. It is a question still open, still live, still suspended, like a held breath, in the long silence that falls between the end of one age and the beginning of the next. The darkness does not forget, and what it holds is patient in ways that time cannot measure.